Okay. Can you see me? Because I'm not
I can see you, yes.
good enough. Okay, thanks. Well, welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us today. We're really excited to have Dr. Jerald Schnoor with us. Jerry is co-director of the University of Iowa Center for Global and Regional Environmental Research. Long word there. He's Alan S. Henry Chair in Engineering at the University of Iowa, professor in the departments of Civil and Environmental Engineering and Occupational Environmental Health. Dr. Schnoor has spent over 40 years in civil and environmental engineering, studying some of the humanity's greatest challenges. His work primarily focuses on climate change and the environment, with an emphasis on water quality. Dr. Schnoor and his students pioneered and developed new methods to help clean water through the use of plants phytoremediation. For this innovative work, Dr. Schnoor received the American Chemical Society Award for Creative Advances in Environmental Science and Technology in spring of 2019. Dr. Schnoor has done a ton of other great work. That's just a top-level sampling. So please join us in welcoming Dr. Schnoor here to our energy lunch discussion today. And thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Andy, and thanks everybody for showing up today. I'm glad to be here, and I'd like to tell you just a little bit about climate change. And Heidi asked me specifically to talk about maybe Northeast Iowa and adaptation to climate change as well. And so that's where we'll start. I'll try to share my slides here. Let's see. It'll let me. I want to go to I have to do it like this. Is that full screen now, Heidi?
Yes, it is.
Okay, good. So climate change and adaptation, it's great to be here. This is the, let's see. It's not letting me. It's not letting me advance. I'll try something else. There we go. This is the Earth that we're all trying to protect and that we're talking about today. And of course, with 8 billion people, believe it or not, this year now on planet Earth. And last time I looked, gross world product of something like $94 trillion. That's enough activity and enough people to influence, first of all, the thin veneer, the atmosphere on planet Earth. But one of the things I'm seeing now is even the oceans are changing. But today we're going to talk about how we might be able to adapt to that. You know that the problem is when we burn fossil fuels, which took millions of years to form, the coal 340 million years since the Carboniferous age, and we're burning it all up in just a couple hundred years. That's the red arrow going up into the atmosphere of carbon dioxide, and then land use changes and deforestation, the other red arrow. And those arrows, unfortunately, are more than the black arrows coming down, the carbon dioxide going into the forests and woody biomass and roots, and the black arrow being absorbed into the ocean sink here. Because the red arrows are bigger than the black arrows, we end up with accumulating carbon dioxide in the atmosphere on our carbon budget. It wouldn't matter too much. It's a trace gas, except that it's radiatively important trace gas. And that changes the energy budget of the Earth. And that's what is causing our problems. Now we've got about 420 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It started out in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution at about 280 parts per million. And most of the anthropogenic, the human-caused warming is due to carbon dioxide, though it's certainly not the only one, but let's say 2/3 of it or so is due to carbon dioxide. If you went to the doctor and this were your blood gases, I think you would be concerned, and we should be concerned as planetary beings as well. When you change the energy balance of the Earth, inevitably you're going to begin to warm the atmosphere. It's a top-down warming. Most of the heat ends up in the ocean. 93% of all the extra heat is going into the oceans, and we know that now pretty well. The last 8 years on Earth have been the warmest years on our instrumental record. This is the temperature difference from going back into the even 1800s. You can see, I think, that the signal began to emerge from the noise around 1980. And the 80s were warmer than any other previous decade, the 90s warmer than that, 2000s, and you get the picture. And we're warming at about 0.18 degrees Celsius each decade. You can see that we're now in a super La Nina, which means it's cold water is influencing the global average temperature, but just wait for that to break this year and next year, and we will have a super El Nino, and we will be extremely warm in the next year or two. The last 8 years have been the warmest ones on record. We're now at about 1.16 degrees Celsius warmer. Global averaged over the whole season. That's about 2 degrees Fahrenheit warmer. And we're setting 2 or 3 warm temperature records on a daily basis at all the recording stations for every cold temperature record. So we're still at the point where we can have very cold temperatures, but we have many, many more warm temperature records and evidence of what is happening. Ever since the Industrial Revolution, we began to burn large quantities of fossil fuels. Emissions have gone up, and up. This is the gigatons, the billions of metric tons of carbon dioxide emitted. And on the x-axis, we have the year. And you can see it going up. Well, here's the pandemic. It did come down a bit, popped right back up the next year in 2022. And this is our goal, according to the Paris Climate Agreement, to reduce our emissions in 2030 by at least 45%. So the blue line indicates how we have to go and fly in the face of this long-term trend of increasing emissions. Basically, it tells me we have to transition out of the fossil fuel age completely to renewable energy sources and low carbon energy sources. It looks like we have, according to the models now, I'm not going to show you many model results. I find that the data is potent enough to tell the story, but it looks like this is the temperature anomaly, and now the difference in temperature from Industrial Revolution times. If we want to keep it at 1.5, that's the Paris Agreement, we only have about 420 billion metric tons of carbon left in our carbon account that we can spend. And that means we only have 10 or 11 years of emissions at the current if we want to keep our warming below 1.5. Remember, it's at 1.16 right now. So what is going to be our future in this changing world? These colored spaghetti lines over here are the model projections of various scenarios of if we do nothing, kind of these reddish simulations here. If we're kind of following the orange right now, it seems like, where we're expected to level off to 2030 and begin to decline our emissions. And that would still result in a 2.7 degrees Celsius warming from 1.1 now. That's 4.8 degrees Fahrenheit, averaged over the whole Earth, over all the seasons. That's a lot of warming. it looks like no matter what, even if we could follow this blue line of severe reductions, that we're going to have a much warmer world with more droughts, wildfires, floods, and sea level rise. So how do we adapt to that? We have to act. We see that, I think, pretty clearly in bringing the emissions and transitioning out of the fossil fuel. This is the critical decade to do that, to follow maybe closer to this blue line path instead of the orange lines. But we also know that we're going to get warmer no matter what. How much warmer is the question. So we need to adapt to all the other climate change. I'm moving to Iowa now, and we're talking about Iowa. Agriculture is one of our biggest emitters, that sector, almost 30% in Iowa. The other big one now is residential, commercial, and industrial energy use, about 27%. Electricity generation has come way down from just a few years ago, 40% of our emissions. Now it's down to 19 because of wind power. As you know, like 57% of our electricity was from wind power last year in Iowa. And transportation has come down due to more fuel efficient vehicles through time. Again, carbon dioxide is the most important gas, but there's several other greenhouse gases that we could spend time talking about, and we need to pay attention to just about all of them. In Iowa emissions, our trend is down slightly. It's been kind of flat for Iowa. The country has done better than Iowa in reducing emissions over the last 10 or 20 years. Coal and wind power generation went up last year. So we used more coal last year, you may know, because of the energy situation and the price of natural gas. Wind power generation continues to go up. Nuclear power is zero now in Iowa, very low carbon power, as you know, but because of the decommissioning of the Palo plant near Cedar Rapids and the Cordova plant on the Mississippi River, we now have no contribution in Iowa from nuclear power. Well, in summary, Iowa is not as warm as the planetary warming. We've warmed about 0.5 to 1 degree Fahrenheit over the last 20 years compared to a base period of 60 years in the 1900s. You can see on this map that Iowa is slightly warmer than the average rest of the country. The South is even cooler due to being so wet and so much rain that causes the latent heat of vaporization, keeps the temperatures down. But Iowa is somewhere in between places like Northeast and Western part of the United States. We are warmer on average. We're also wetter on average, about 10 to 15% wetter on average over the last 30 years. You can see on this map, Iowa is in the center and northeastern part is really what has gotten the most increase in average precipitation. But as you know, it's not really average precipitation that does the damages. It's more the precipitation events, the big events. And we have had a significant increase in our 1 in 100-year floods are now 1 in 25-year floods, and 1 in 20-year precipitation events are shown on this map from the National Climate Assessment. Again, showing Iowa having a lot of extreme events, especially in the winter, spring, and fall, not quite so many in the summer. To summarize then, Iowa's warmest temperatures are actually cooler in the summer. Decades ago, we had 100-degree days. We almost never have a 100-degree day anymore. It's again because we're wetter than we used to be. That wetness requires energy. It takes a lot of energy to heat wet air. So our warmest temperatures in the summer are actually cooler than they used to be, but our coldest temperatures in the wintertime are much warmer than they used to be. And our winters are much milder than they used to be. Other climate impacts we could talk about that we need to adapt to is pollen is up about 30% compared to past decades. Humidity is really up, especially nighttime humidity, which is keeping our nighttime temperatures higher than they used to be decades ago. And that is projected to continue to rise humidity. Summer is projected to become drier on average in Iowa. So we're going to have these flood events and more precipitation on average would be the projection, but it'll be punctuated by drought and mainly drought in the summertime. More floods, as we talked about earlier, and we will be warmer, especially in the winter and at night, and wetter overall. How do we adapt? Well, Winneshiek is pretty agricultural. And I think that Decorah is maybe your biggest city. And so I thought I'd start with talking about agricultural adaptations. We need to decrease our nitrogen use because the nitrogen we're using, the anhydrous ammonia, is being giving us N2O, nitrous oxide, a potent greenhouse gas to the atmosphere, but it's also using a lot of natural gas to make that fertilizer. That's why it's so expensive right now. We need to protect our streams and wetlands because it's going to get wetter and there's going to be more severe events, as we talked about. We need to improve soil health. We've lost about half of our topsoil since pre-settlement days, since the mid-1800s, and we need to put some of that back. Maybe soil organic matters need to double from about 2% to 4%. One way to help with those things is to use more cover crops. To reduce our soil erosion, we need best management practices, contour plowing, riparian zone buffer strips, all kinds of efforts, including cover crops, to reduce soil erosion. And farmers and all of us need to reduce our environmental footprint and become closer to carbon neutral. We've ignored our aquifers for too long, even in a water-rich place like Iowa, getting more precipitation than it used to. I remember as a boy growing up in Davenport, we used to say that we got 32 inches of rain a year. Well, now it's like 38 inches of rain a year. And in a water-rich place, we've ignored our aquifers and we're depleting our aquifers on an unsustainable basis. So that's one of the adaptations. We need to treat water highly and begin to recharge those depleted aquifers. The risk of soil erosion increases with increased extreme precipitation events, which are being projected for us. Some urban adaptations, we can talk about what cities should do, like Decorah. These are community efforts, adaptation. We need to identify vulnerable populations and develop a communication plan for them, even evacuation plans in times of flooding. We need to assess and plan for climate-related health impacts, chronic wasting disease, Lyme disease, and so forth. All of these are moving these vector-borne diseases as we warm. Assess stormwater preparedness, both in cities and in neighborhoods. And harden our infrastructure. I think you're doing that already in your cities from what I've read, but this has to do with raising low parts of highways, improving bridges, raising bridges in some cases, raising electrical substations, putting electrical facilities on the top of buildings instead of in the basement, flood-proofing buildings such that if they do flood, all you have to do is hose it down and away you go again. For individuals and families, there's all kinds of things we can do to adapt to this changing climate. Everything, green infrastructure, green roofs, permeable pavements, rain gardens, bioswales, things like planting native plants for biodiversity. I think you're doing that in Winneshiek, and planting native trees to increase shade and control water. Building adaptations, there's all kinds of things we can do to adapt our buildings, existing buildings and new buildings, both. And both can use LET type of certifications. It doesn't have to be LEED. It can be any type of certification. It can be just going down a checklist by planners and developers. We need to reduce our energy usage in our buildings, maybe as much as 80% by 2050, with a goal being net zero emissions as a planetary basis by 2050. Renewable energy, certainly that's a big part of the transition, and energy efficiency. Hopefully we're all about that already. So what can we do? We need to mitigate, we need to adapt. I'm trying to emphasize adaptation here because it is going to get warmer. It is going to get worse before it gets better. But we have a plan for it to get better through mitigation and collaboration. 197 countries agreed on the Paris Agreement. It's soft law. There's not real teeth involved, and it's hard in times of pandemic and a war in Europe. It's hard at this time to gather all the money and the willpower to abide by those agreements, but at least we're talking about it. We've got an agreement, and we have made improvements already. The goal is, as you know, 45% emission reductions by 2030. That's a tall order. We're not on the way to that yet in Iowa or in Winneshiek, I don't think, or as a planet Earth either. But we need to be completely out of the fossil fuel age, at least net zero. We'll still burn some fossil fuels. We'll still burn some biofuels, but we're going to have to offset that with taking carbon dioxide out of the air with more plantations, for example, for net zero by 2050. And we have to think about each other more than we have. Reduce greenhouse gas. This is a mission to do together. One of the low-hanging fruits, and we can talk about in questions, is methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas, 15 to 20% of the problem, but it only lasts in the atmosphere about 10 or 12 years. If we can just plug all the leaks, we'll go a long ways towards leveling off methane emissions and saving natural gas. It's considered a low-hanging fruit. We can do that, but we need to get on it. Right now is really hard time to raise money because of the pandemic, a looming global recession, perhaps. It's hard to get countries to fulfill their pledges to help vulnerable countries and vulnerable people. But we need to do that. That's very important. And we're moving towards a time when, like environmental impact statements, every financial decision should be evaluated on the basis of how it will affect climate change. We established in November in Egypt, in the Conference of the Parties 27, a new fund for vulnerable countries, a loss and damages, which the U.S. has resisted through the last few meetings, and I've been at all of these meetings. But loss and damages hopefully will not open us up to lawsuits, but rather will allow us to help other countries. We're all in this together. Everybody has to participate in transitioning out of the fossil fuel age. Those island nations, poor countries in sub-Saharan Africa, they have suffered the most and are already suffering, having to even abandon islands, for example, in the South Pacific and in Indian Ocean, and they have done the least to cause it and are suffering the most. So these kind of transfer payments, I think, will help us to achieve our goals for the global environment. And also, it's the right thing to do. If we enact the Paris Agreement, I would argue it'll be a much better future. You know, we're talking about, imagine completely clean air, no more childhood asthma, or much less childhood asthma, completely clean air, no particles in the air. Imagine seeing it cross the Grand Canyon 100 miles again, like we used to be able to. Imagine less emphysema, less loss of work due to a healthier population. We know when the particles in the air increase, people check into the hospital and they don't come back out. The morbidity and mortality is huge, with even small increments in the fine particles in the air. We know that quite well from epidemiology. We need to consider the Sustainable Development Goals, which we haven't talked about, but really it's a plan to improve the entire human condition. So where we're heading is something much, much better than we have right now, with social justice and equity and sustainable development. A huge increase in jobs, millions and millions of high quality jobs as we move towards electrifying almost everything, using more renewable power, wind, solar, and we'll need some battery storage as well. Electric vehicles, even the batteries in our vehicles can be a part of the storage. We call it V2G, vehicles to grid, where through public charging stations, if you don't need the energy, you can put it in at times where the energy is needed in the grid and fill up your battery at night when there's very little demand. Smart grid and pricing is where we're heading, weatherizing all our homes, and it really will create millions and millions of high quality jobs here in the US as we rebuild our infrastructure. It's kind of a misnomer in a way, but the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, bipartisan act, it really is the very first climate legislation we ever had. It's not enough, it's a start, but it's the only climate bill we had. I started teaching about this in 1990. I'm showing my age now. And in 1990, if you had told me that by the year 2023, we would not have comprehensive climate legislation in the US and the richest country in the world, and we would not have an energy legislation or plan, I would have said, you're crazy. Of course we'll address those issues, but we have not. This is the only climate legislation that we have just passed last year, and it's quite ambitious in many ways. It would lead us towards a 40% emission reduction. Remember, the goal is 45 or 50%, but at least right now we're heading towards about 25%, I'll be honest with you, at the rate that we're going now. So this is a very important act. Energy tax credits over a 10-year period, renews those for wind and solar. $9 billion in home energy rebates. There's a qualifier. It's especially targeted to low income and disadvantaged groups. Even community solar power is in there. There's so many interesting ramifications of this bill. Most of the new wind power is slated to be offshore, the incentives from this. For Iowa, we have incentives for biodiesel, incentives to make aviation fuels instead of ethanol for motor fuel, hydrogen, fuel cells, and more modular nuclear power. Environmental justice is a big part of the bill. You know, I teach about Cancer Alley and people who are suffering from high levels of pollution. Right, $60 billion of this bill is slated for disadvantaged communities of color who have suffered already. It's a 30% tax credit for residential solar. An individual home can benefit more than $20,000 from this legislation. $14,000 for home energy upgrades, $8,000 if you install a heat pump. There are provisions for air source heat pumps as well. And families, low-income families, can save up to $1,800 a year on energy bills. The climate provisions have a lot in there for Iowa. $20 billion for farmers to rotate crops and to use cover crops more. We're going to buy a lot of electric vehicles for our postal service, improve pollution at transit, buses, and ports. And it raises, actually, we can talk about the carbon storage pipelines and what you all think about that. But it raises the incentives from $50 a metric ton to $85 per metric ton for carbon sequestration. And that would include the proposed pipelines in Iowa. So in conclusion, we need to act now. We need to mitigate, but the emphasis of our talk today is on adapting. Sometimes those two can't be, are not mutually exclusive. If we adapt in the right way, we will also mitigate our greenhouse gas emissions, but we need to do both. The benefits are many. It's going to be a much, much better world that we're shooting for, and it will be the economic engine for jobs for our kids and our kids' kids in the future. A lot of good things are happening already with wind and solar. Just look at what's happened in Iowa already, but we're not moving fast enough. So we have to move faster if we want to avoid the worst ramifications of climate change in the future. And that's all I got, Heidi, but I'm here for questions if you guys have time.
Thank you so much. So if anyone has questions, feel free to, we're a small enough group, you can just unmute yourself and ask. Otherwise, you can type it into the chat and I will read it out.
Should I unshare?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Quiet group today.
Can you hear me, Heidi?
Yes.
Hi, Jerry. This is Andy again. My video is
Hi,
not
Andy.
working.
Hi, Andy.
But I got a quick question about the Iowa emissions. You had mentioned earlier in your slide that they've dropped a little bit, not compared to the rest of the country very well, but about 3% maybe in a decade or more. And yet you noted that we've had very significant renewable energy. So significant, much larger reductions in the energy sector in Iowa. So what gives? What's going up if energy is going down so much?
Our vehicle miles haven't gone down as much as the rest of the country, Andy. That's one sector, but also our, and you could argue it's a good thing, but you know, our manufacturing sector is strong in Iowa, and you saw that. I think you saw the slide with the residential, commercial, and industrial emission. Those have gone up, and those two things are largely responsible. You raise a great question. Yeah, we're not doing as well as the country as a whole. Even despite 57% of our electricity being produced by wind now. Of course, solar is the, as you probably know, Andy, I really think solar is the missing piece of the puzzle. Solar goes so well with wind here. And we have actually a pretty good solar resource, and that's the missing piece. And of course, that obviates the need for some storage also, because when the sun isn't shining at night, the wind is blowing here. The wind actually blows better at night in Iowa than it does in the daytime. So we need to build out that solar for sure. And the IRA legislation should help us to do that.
Right. Yeah, I agree. In fact, I just dropped a link in the chat for folks. My friend and colleague Brian Cranbeer with My Energy Co-op up here. We just had a column in the Register on Sunday about solar siting, which is one of our political hot potatoes in the state. So everyone do reach out to your legislators and encourage them to keep that door wide open, because there's been some resistance and we want to make sure the door stays open in Iowa for solar. Yeah. That
really surprised me, Andy, and I've read all your columns, I think, in the Gazette. I believe one was in the Des Moines Register. Congratulations on that, and I couldn't agree more. And I was really perplexed when at the payload plant, when all the opposition came out to building a large solar farm there.
Yeah, yep. More questions? Come on, folks.
One of the things you alluded to, one slide was hydrogen, and of course, green hydrogen is different from blue or brown. Any comments on the state of that technology and how you see it evolving?
Well, that it's a great question, Lyle. Thank you for that. I think Iowa could have a real advantage there also on green hydrogen, because we've got so much wind now, and we can use electrolysis. The other cells, they started out at like 8% efficiency. They were terrible efficiency. Now we know how to make an electrolysis cell much smarter. There's research in the IRA bill for this too. It can be much more efficient, and we should be able to make hydrogen when we don't need all the energy off of the grid at night from wind. And so that's an opportunity. That's green hydrogen, as you say. There'd be no need if you just use electrolysis to deep six carbon dioxide, but the blue and the brown hydrogen all requires carbon pipelines, and you have to get rid of the carbon if you continue to make like we're doing now. We're making all our hydrogen now from methane and abstracting the hydrogens in steam reformation, and therefore you have to have a pipeline and you have to deep six it.
I've got a question for you, Jerry. I don't know if you can hear me. I'm Aaron Detter. I work here at the Regional Council of Governments in Northeast Iowa. As far as agriculture being that largest contributor in Iowa currently, what do you see as some of the additional possible solutions? You mentioned, some of the fertilizer use, but what's even possible, because so many things are political non-starters if it's going to affect the bottom line for farmers.
Well, the biggest ones are what you already mentioned, greenhouse gas emitted as a function of, in our case, mostly anhydrous ammonia usage, and that would indicate that hopefully we could value that and figure out ways to have nitrogen efficiency. They're talking about using more nitrogen fixing bacteria like appear on soybeans and legumes. But the other part of the story, and maybe this is the more golden opportunity, and that is manure management. The animals, and we'd like to be able to figure out, and in Northeast Iowa, you are already trying with the dairy farms to do some manure to make gas. And with microturbines, we can make electricity now. But it's cold enough in Iowa that it's a big challenge. We need improvements there. We need research there such that we can lower our methane emissions from manure management. I think that's the real opportunity for us.
Thanks a lot, Jerry. I was just going to say too, how much of that is from the farm, the large ag equipment itself, which is all, of course, fossil fuel powered, and what's happening in that area, if anything?
We've had improvements in that. It is a significant part. I'm going to guess 10 to 20%, Aaron, of the total ag emissions. But as you know, we have fewer passes through the field now because of genetically modified, and I think that has actually improved over time, but it is still a major contributor, as you said.
Thanks so much.
Just to add to the nitrogen conversation, I just dropped another link in the chat also to a podcast that discusses interesting discussion anyway around decarbonizing the production of nitrogen. And as Jerry mentioned, it is by far the biggest contributor to emissions from ag. And we use, I mean, on the front side, it's the natural gas in the manufacture of ammonia. We probably put more nitrogen on our cornfields in the form of ammonia through that manufacture process than our entire residential sector uses in the state for home heating. So that's really big. And then on the backside, we've got the nitrous oxides that are created through our agricultural practices and from the use of that ammonia in the soil. Both of those hold tremendous potential. But even just on the front side, you know, if we could transition ammonia, and we're a smart species, and some of these solutions do come down to engineering and technology, but if we could transition our ammonia production to using sustainable energy, renewables, largely from the Midwest, you know, we could certainly over a decade and a half or so entirely cut out that whole front end of needing natural gas. We need fuel stock, and we need the energy source to create the ammonia for fertilizer use. That doesn't deal with the problem of overuse of fertilizer and nitrous oxides on the field. We still need to deal with that, but there's a lot of potential there still. So just wanted to toss that in.
Olmsted County in Minnesota, their NRCS office is trialing a program where they're paying farmers to try out cover crops. And so trying to remove some of those barriers of the fear of losing money if you don't do it well, and also put people into sort of a cohort so they can learn from each other. So it's their first year trying it this year. There are a lot of programs out there where you get paid based on how well you do, and this one is just like, you're willing to try it, we're going to give you some money. So I'm excited to see if they get good adoption through that program.
That's great. We had a good participation for the limited amount of funds here in Iowa at the state level. So there's a lot of interest, and I'm sure in Winnebago County, there's a lot of interest as well.
Yes, for sure. It's growing. And together, of course, with no-till farming, with no-till practices, especially permanent no-till, the seasonal no-till isn't quite so helpful. And of course, all of that can help reduce the impacts, the need for fertilizer and the impacts of nitrous oxides. It can also then, as you were discussing, you know, add carbon to the soil, and that sequestration also helps with our emissions benefit balance. So, yeah.
That's right. Well, if there's no more questions, Heidi, I'd like to say thank you for letting speak to the group, and if there's anything I can do in the future, just let me know.
Last call for questions. Anything anyone else want to toss into the mix? I have a quick one for you then, since we've got a couple minutes, if you're still okay here.
Sure.
You know, and you're certainly active at the state level, and policy wise, EVs have become a bit of a hot topic in Iowa. And it's tied into a lot of issues around Iowa ag and politics in general. But how do you see the adoption of EVs coming around, certainly where you are, maybe a little bit faster than where we are, and the transition towards a full electrification of our transportation systems?
Well, gosh, Andy, we're not anywhere near California.
No, I know. Yeah.
I was just out, I think at Arizona State, I gave a talk, not so different than the one we just talked about. And at Arizona State, they have EV chargers. First of all, there's Teslas everywhere, and EV chargers all over campus. It's free for faculty, staff, and students. So you never have any fuel costs. They have robots going all over campus and so forth. And it's an Iowan, actually. Michael Crow is president there. You may know him, Andy, and he's sort of a visionary. And I think they're doing, we could do a lot more. And maybe this Inflation Reduction Act will help us to take advantage more. But like I said, in general, the EV adoption is one of the solutions. I really think vehicle to grid is an important part. There's 600 gigawatts. We have 240 million cars in the US. Only a few percent are EVs right now. And if 240, just imagine 240 million batteries in an electric vehicle, it gives you 600 gigawatts of storage. And so it instantly allows you to begin to have some storage in the grid, which is so desperately needed. And we can do better here in Iowa.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, I have one last quick question, but I'll open it up again. Anyone else have a question to toss in first?
We've got one in the chat.
Do I see a gap between the new legislation and the need for how to educate people, I think? Is that it, Heidi?
That would be my guess. Yeah.
Okay. I think that the new legislation, you know, in some sense, we've moved away from regulations and what we call command and control regulations. All of these, almost the entire act is incentives. It's only going to work if we participate. So the question as asked by Mr. Sliwa is a good one, in that if we don't take advantage of these incentives, nothing is going to happen. And therefore, education is a very important part of it. I would say that we had not done a good job of educating people, and the Act doesn't really do that either. How much they can benefit, you know, the carrot, and how important it is, the stick, how we're going to have to live with this climate change, and it's not pretty. So we need better education, and that's partly I'm an educator. I'm to fault for that.
Yep, I'm a broken record. I tossed one more link in the chat there for the fact sheets that my colleague Paul Cutting has put together and Heidi worked on. So thank you for that. We'll be working on it.
We don't do thou shalt not legislation anymore, you know, command and control anymore. So if this is the way it's got to be with these incentives, by God, we got to take advantage of them.
Right. And it's a really good question, because these rebate programs, especially the $9 billion that's available for rebates for homeowners, for households, are actually quite complicated, sadly so. They're not available yet in Iowa because they're going to be implemented by states, state by state by state, per some federal rules. And it might take much of this year before they actually become available. So we'll be working hard to get those messages out and help folks, but it's not going to be a simple thing.
And thank you for that and all that you guys do.
Jerry, I have an ecological question for you. Regarding adaptation, but especially around our natural systems. You know, plant communities migrate historically over time. When we've had climate change over the, hundreds of thousands of years, plant communities have migrated. But this climate change is happening over the decades, and it's a lot tougher for plant communities and individual species to move. And of course, we dominate the landscape. They don't have a lot of places to move to in their potential migration. But we also have these extremes, and this is one of my real questions. Like you said, our coldest lows typically are getting a little bit warmer in the winter, except that every few years we still have here, at least at my farm, 38 below. So, maybe for the average year, some southern plants are going to do well in the future up here, except when we continue to get these extremes of climate in the process, they might not do so well. Is this an issue that you've thought about? And this is applicable, I think, to our natural systems as well as our ecological systems. For the average, the new means we may be able to have some different kinds of plants, species, agriculture, but for the extremes, that still might not work. What are your thoughts on that?
I think you raise an excellent point. The biggest deleterious effects of the averages so far, I would say, are in the ocean. The poleward migration of fish populations are decimating ocean ecology. So, regarding land-based, it's not so clear. The extinctions, we do still have real swings with these events, both positive and negative, though way more warmer than colder. one of the things that, and I'm not a climatologist, I'm just a climate policy engineer, I guess, chemical engineer by training, but the climatologists are worrying about and you probably read about the instability at the polar vortex, the immensely cold air over the Arctic, for example, which seems to be becoming unstable now because the Arctic is so warm and it's causing it to wobble. And that mass of extremely cold air wobbles down onto, seems like Iowa and Siberia. That's partly why our average temperatures aren't as high as the global average temperature has become. So they call it a blocking phenomena, you know, when the jet stream comes way down into Texas, like has happened. And if that becomes a pattern of climate change, and I'd say it's still too early to say from what I've read, but if that becomes a pattern, that'll really enforce the extremes that you're talking about.
Right.
And that'll be hard for plants and animals to adapt to.
Yep.
So we've got a message in the chat, but I also see that Hannah McCarger is unmuted. Hannah, did you have a question or a comment? No? Okay. The one in the chat is, one major problem with incentives, perhaps besides their disproportional benefit to affluent people, is that they are consumption-based model. Isn't the idea that we can consume our way out of climate change some sort of cognitive dissonance when it is our outsized consumption habits that have gotten us into this problem in the first place? Rhetorical, but open to any thought you or others may have.
I wish I knew the answer to that one. That's a terrific question. Yes, I mean, the basic problem, many would say, is that we are 8 billion people and we continue to want to grow and use and consume more and more things. And on a finite planet, that seems impossible on some level. But what we're talking about here is a better way of doing things. And if our questioner can accept that there is a better way of doing things with less impact, I don't see any alternative to at least trying. We are all in this together, but that's a great question. Incentives are consumption-based. The only thing I would add is that this IRA, we should take some comfort in the fact that it does target so much to disadvantaged population. It's really the first time that we've done that with the eye towards communities, and the communities word is everywhere in the legislation, 750-page act. Communities of color, communities who are disadvantaged, previously communities who have been redlined, who are in cancer alleys with extreme pollution. It tries to address that, and I would say for maybe the first time.
Yeah, one way to look at that is that the people who cannot afford to replace the old technology that is causing the problem can't replace it without incentives. And it will still exist in its longest form unless we have a way to help those who can least afford it transition to the new. So that's the other side of that incentive process.
Well put, Lyle. I agree.
All right, we got a few more minutes. Last call for questions.
Bribery is also an effective incentive for humans.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jerry. Thank you all for joining us today. Keep your eye on your email. Our next energy lunch will be on the 21st of February. And it probably will be a policy conversation. So we hope you'll join us for that.
And this will be posted on the website then?
Yes. Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jerry.
Thank you, guys. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.